Hey everybody, Andy Ryder here with Project Lab. So I remember back in April 2017, I was watching Jimmy DiResta's portable bandsaw stand video on YouTube, thinking to myself, okay, this is awesome. I'm totally gonna enjoy this video, but I am literally never gonna make this thing. I didn't have a welder, I didn't have a portable bandsaw, and I didn't have a computer-controlled plasma cutter. Jimmy used one of those to make his, and while they're awesome, they cost multiple thousands of dollars. Then I got a welder. And then I got a portable bandsaw because they're really nice for precisely cutting metal, which you kind of need in welding. And then I got to thinking, could I use simple tools to make that bandsaw stand instead of a high-tech plasma cutter? Basically, I realized that while these portable bandsaws are great, to really unlock the potential of these things, you gotta mount them in a stand. That's because then you can move tiny little work pieces through the blade. There's lots of options out there for DIY bandsaw stands. I kind of was drawn to Jimmy's because I really had no idea whether I could pull this off, but wouldn't it be awesome if I could? So I did some research.
How does a portable bandsaw stand working out? This is from Andrew Reuter. Anything you'd change about it if you built it again? Honestly, it works really good. I just don't ever use the chopping aspect of it. That's the only thing I would get rid of, that top bendy, that top pivot.
And then I contacted Jimmy to see if he'd send me the design for the stand, and he did because he's a super nice guy. And then I got stuck for a bit. Jimmy's bandsaw is a DeWalt. Mine is from Harbor Freight. While the curve on the back is very similar, it's not exactly the same. I didn't want to spend a bunch of time trying to replicate the Harbor Freight one in Adobe Illustrator and have it be screwed up anyway. So after a couple of months of thinking, I came up with an idea that would let me skip recreating that curve digitally. We'll talk about that later. But in any case, I had a plan, so I was able to get started. Are you helping? So I printed off the design on some cardstock. Thank you. Thank you. And I cut that out with a hobby knife. And then I lined up the separate segments on a piece of steel and used magnets to hold them down and precisely get them in place before taping it all together. The little bit of excess tape here that I'm cutting off. And then I used the magnet trick again to hold the full-size stencil on a piece of steel, and then spray painted it. Jimmy used 16 gauge cold rolled steel for this. I couldn't find a big enough piece of that in a retail store around here. So I actually had to track down a steel supplier and go there instead. That was a little intimidating, but the good thing about that was that it was way cheaper. I got 3 times as much metal for about the same price. And with the stencil removed, you can see the parts that I need to cut out. For my first cuts, I used a straight edge and an angle grinder to cut off the straight parts of the design. And then I used a good sized drill bit to drill some maneuvering holes into the inside areas of the cutouts. And then I pulled out my trusty jigsaw. This is gonna be loud. And I just started hacking away with the metal cutting blade. So this didn't start out going smoothly because the saw vibrates way more cutting through metal like this than it does with wood. So my normal methods of holding the jigsaw in place, like with this Black & Decker workmate, just weren't working. Eventually I settled on literally screwing the board down to the workmate, and that held it. And so I just worked my way around the design, getting as close to the line as I could, And if it was a straight line, I cut right to it. But if it was a more complicated shape, I tried leaving a little bit so I could come back and touch it up later. You can even use the blade to kind of carve into the smaller areas, kind of like how Jimmy does with a bandsaw. This wears you out because you are basically trying to be precise with a jackhammer here. Jimmy complains a lot about using jigsaws or scroll saws, and he's totally right. It's miserable. The thing is that if you can stand the misery, look at the results I was able to get with this. No, it's not as good as a plasma cutter, but you do pretty good for a machine that you can pick up for 50 bucks. For these really tight spots, I drilled smaller holes and then went at them with a Dremel. And then I went back through and cleaned everything up with files. And then the young sir got home. Hi, Malcolm.
Daddy have a hammer?
Yeah.
He's got a file.
Hi, Malcolm. How are you? Yes. Hi, Malcolm. As you can see, the files really clean things up. It makes you start to feel like you know what you're doing. So now it was time to make the curved backer piece. So I used the bandsaw to cut a bending fork and cut that strip out with the angle grinder. Smooth the edges with a belt sander and got the bend in. Another way that the Harbor Freight bandsaw differs from the DeWalt is that there was this little outcropping piece that I had to notch around. I bent the top and the bottom pieces separately and then welded them together, just like Jimmy did in the video. I think it did make it easier because then you weren't using such a big piece in the bending fork. And then I roughly located that backer piece. I was doing everything I could to make sure that it was gonna work at this point, including doing some final adjustments. So with all the parts cut out, now comes the scary part, actually welding to that back plate that I just spent hours and hours cutting out. Here goes nothing. So I've got to hit this one again. Welding this 16 gauge steel with my stick welder worked, but it was really rough. Which was surprising because I had tested this the first time I got the welder and it worked fine. But maybe this part was too complex for my welding skills with this machine. The good news is that it's blowing through this brace piece and not the big DiResta piece that took all the work. That would be a bummer if it was the other way around. But anyway, I got it sorted out. Didn't look the best, but it was gonna get painted anyway. I was more concerned about safety at that point. I didn't want something breaking off. the thing was holding together and it was time to cut out the rest of the back. And this was my idea for that process. Instead of designing a pattern to cut to in Illustrator, I just used the backer piece that was custom bent to the shape of the bandsaw as a guide for the blade. The blade just doesn't want to cut straight into a big tall piece like that. So it ends up acting like a path to follow, and it would generally only cut through where I wanted it to. And this worked great. I'm real glad that I didn't try to spend all that time digitally figuring this out. It's the moment of truth. I was tempted to fake this shot once I had it actually working, but we're gonna see if this actually fits first try. All right, it's pretty close. I gotta cut this piece out. I gotta smooth out some of the edges. And I think this will work. Part of the problem is that I've got this in the completely wrong spot, I guess. Dang it. It is darn close. I either gotta shave down the rubber or move the weld. I'm not looking forward to moving the weld, but I suppose that's probably the better choice. Okay. This feels pretty solid. Those didn't take. I don't know how long this is gonna take, so off camera I'm gonna try to build some of this stuff up and see if I can get it to connect again. Hey, cool, it fits. And then I could start drilling the holes for attaching the stand to the bandsaw. For Jimmy's, he just screwed right into the rubber on the back of his bandsaw. I was hesitant to do this because it's a Harbor Freight saw, and the DeWalt one probably wasn't designed for that. This Harbor Freight one definitely wasn't designed for that, and it's much cheaper. So it very well might have been fine to just do it the way he did it. I didn't want to be thinking about that every time I used the saw for the rest of the time. So instead, I decided to reuse the screw holes for that cover that are in the bandsaw. And this process was a pain in the butt, because try as I might to get the holes precisely in the right spot, because I'm a human being, it's just never gonna happen pretty much. So this was a lot of guessing and checking. Some of them I hit right away, others I had to just drill out the holes to make some room for the screw to attach. And that's fine for this. I did need to get some longer screws in order to reach in, and you had to be real careful not to tighten the screws too much, or else it would strip out that aluminum casting. So I started cutting out the rest of the pieces, the top and the bottom V's. The throat depth on the bandsaw just isn't quite big enough to cut these out the whole way, so I had to roughly cut them there and then finish them up with a cutting disc on an angle grinder. I ended up clamping the two V pieces together to help ensure that they were the exact same. And I just got close to the line and then took it the rest of the way with the belt sander and the bench grinder. And then I cut the rest of the brace pieces. At this point, I took a break for a little bit because after those first welds going so poorly, I just had to stop and get some gumption again to be able to finish welding this thing up with that stick welder. And then I got out of it because instead I won this Eastwood MIG welder from the Eastwood YouTube channel. Could not have come at a better time. That thing worked so good in comparison. I've got a video about it. I'll link to it here. You should go check it out. Totally saved me on this project. I first used the MIG welder to clean up some of the bad welds from before. And then I started adding those pieces that I just cut out. And it went really well. I guess I should admit that I was also a little apprehensive before welding here because I was worried about welding everything up backwards. I have a pretty good ability to do this where you know in your head, don't do this wrong, don't do this wrong, don't do this wrong. And then you start doing it and you take a step back and realize, nope, I just did it wrong. And I really didn't want to screw this up, obviously. I welded these on backwards. They should be pointing like this. You know, I spent all this time procrastinating and worrying about it, and then I took no precautions to prevent this from happening. I should have had this sketch in front of me and then figured out a way to transfer some marks from that sketch to the piece. Maybe stick a red dot at the tip of the V's and put another red dot next to the side that should be touching, just to make sure that when you're in the moment you can confirm those red dots are in the right place to confirm the orientation. I know that now. Next time. And so I cut apart all that good work. And unfortunately, I had to redo all those pieces because as I was cutting, I favored the support pieces for the cutting edge because I didn't want to lose any material on the designed face, which would be much harder to fix. But this gave me a chance to try another method of cutting straight lines in steel, and that is a shears. And this was by far the best method for cutting straight lines that I found. And then finally I was back to square one, and then I could redo that welding. I welded the nuts to help prop up that side to keep the bandsaw from tipping over. And then welding on the brace pieces in the back, which I kind of just had to eyeball where they needed to go. And then this part was pretty much done. It was time to try fitting it to the saw again. And unfortunately, it didn't fit. Well, didn't anticipate that one. This is another area where the DeWalt and the Harbor Freight bandsaws are different enough that too much of the stuff on the Harbor Freight saw stick into the area where those braces need to be. You'd never be able to get your hand in comfortably to hold the handle and the trigger if you were using it in a hand-holding mode. So I had to cut those pieces off and come up with a different solution. My wife, the engineer, works with steel all the time, making sure that buildings stand up. So she helped me think about this.
If that's all you're trying to do, having it come up.
Oh, yeah. That would, like right here
yeah.
would still be enough?
Right. Because bringing it more in here is just going to help with this sort of twisting or buckling, but this piece doesn't feel like it's going to. So I think you might be fine to just do it where you can.
Sounds good to me. And Malcolm helped a little bit too. Malcolm. Yep, I'm working. You see a ladder? How was school? Yeah. Was it good? Did you learn anything? Busy bugs? Oh, cool.
Cookies.
And cookies? Also cool.
Dump trucks.
And dump trucks?
Yeah.
Awesome. Alright, should we go get a snack?
Yeah.
Okay. For the top part, there was enough room for a shorter version of the brace. But for the back, I just couldn't find a place to put it where you could comfortably fit your hand in there. So my idea was maybe I could just use 1/4-inch round rod. At first I was thinking, I think I have to stick with sheet metal or else I'm gonna get too far away from Jimmy's design. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense that this still fit. He used 1/4-inch rod later in the miter cutting jig. When I welded that together, it was still a little bit bendy, but when I added a straight bar across, that made a big difference. Alright, I've been away from this for a couple of months. Used it over the summer, now it's all rusty. We'll have to take care of that. But before I can do that, I want to refine this just a little bit. Specifically with where I screw into the bandsaw. It's a little too far out, and I think that also means that it's a little bit tippier than it needs to be. You know, I only have to go to before it'll tip over on its own. It'll still be clamped down. I just want to take care of this now and make it as stable as possible. Considering that this design was based on the DeWalt bandsaw and I'm shoehorning it into the Harbor Freight saw, it's no surprise that this is a little bit different, or perhaps this lip is too thick on mine. So I'm gonna measure from the DiResta typeface and mark new screw holes, and I will drill those new holes. And then I marked a line at the same height around this curved brace piece and cut that off. So my line actually cut through a few of the holes that I had previously drilled, but I was able to use the MIG welder to fill those in. It worked great. I definitely wasn't doing that with the stick welder. The bandsaw is reinstalled, and now I see two things. One, I need to move this brace on the back because my hand is now hitting it because the bandsaw is back further. Because this new bar is bigger than the old one, I added in these diagonal pieces to try to stiffen it up a bit. And I can still grab it where I need to. And two, this is still a little bit too tippy for my tastes. I'm just too much of a klutz for that. So I think I'm going to use more of that 1/4-inch round rod and make some brace pieces for the top and the bottom so that it's supported both when it's sitting right side up and upside down. And then it was time for paint, so I cleaned it up. There wasn't much for big rust, it was all pretty much surface rust, so I just used a rust converting primer paint. And then came back through with Montana Gold Black, which is always a joy to use. It just works so well. And a little bit of clear coat, and hung it up to dry. It looks pretty cool. That paint really does help. So now all that was left to do was to add those wood backer pieces. Jimmy actually didn't show this part in his video, so I just kind of guessed. I had to cut them up into separate pieces or else they wouldn't fit back there with the bandsaw in place, and I just really didn't want to remove that bandsaw again. I just used hot glue to glue them in place. This has not held up the best. They do bust out. I ended up following it up with some gaffer tape. I'll eventually glue them back in, maybe with a stronger hot glue, we'll see. And with that, just over a year later, the bandsaw stand was complete. In the end, I think this project really is doable by the average person without high-tech tools. Working steel by hand is intimidating, but it's actually very forgiving, precisely because of how hard it is. It just takes a long time to work with it. Way too much time for someone as busy as Jimmy DiResta to spend on it without using a CNC plasma cutter, but totally doable for hobbyists who aren't getting paid by the project. Speaking of time, now it's November 2019, and I've been dragging my feet on this video for more than a year. But even after all the hours I've spent on this project, getting my arms shaken off, redoing all my work, banging my head against the wall trying to figure out how to edit this video, I still love looking at this thing. It's super handy, yet it's also a legitimate piece of metal sculpture just sitting in my workshop. I get to be reminded by this thing I pulled off every time I walk in here. I think it looks awesome. What do you think?
What is that?
It's a portable bandsaw, and this is a stand.
What does it do?
It cuts stuff. I was making this back when you could barely talk. Did it turn out good?
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Let's make something else too.
Okay, we can do that. If you like this video, I welcome you to subscribe. If you have any thoughts or questions, you can leave them in the comments down below on YouTube. I try to reply to everybody who stops by. Thanks for watching. You want to say goodbye?
Bye-bye. Squeeze it.
Squeeze it.